Tonight is about honesty, my daughter-in-law said with a smile as I walked into the private dining room where they were supposedly throwing my 53rd birthday party. Everyone laughed softly like I had missed the joke, but the moment I looked around, I felt something cold settle deep in my chest. The room was beautiful in a way that almost felt staged for someone else's life. Gold balloons floated above the tables. White roses filled crystal vases. A jazz piano version of Happy Birthday drifted through hidden speakers. My son Daniel stood near the bar pretending to check his phone, and my husband Richard wouldn't look directly at me. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the decorations. Not the giant cake covered in silver frosting. Not the champagne glasses lined perfectly across the table. My husband avoiding my eyes after 30 years of marriage. Vanessa walked toward me in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my first car. Her smile looked polished and careful, the same smile she used at charity events and country club dinners whenever she wanted people to think she was kind. "You made it," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "We were worried traffic from Westport would slow you down." I forced a smile. I wouldn't miss my own birthday. The words sounded strange coming out of my mouth, because suddenly I wasn't sure this evening belonged to me at all. In the center of the room sat a single velvet chair facing everyone else. I remember staring at it while my stomach tightened. "Why is that chair there?" I asked lightly. Vanessa exchanged a glance with Richard before answering. "Because tonight is about celebrating you, Evelyn." The way she said my name made it sound rehearsed. Daniel finally looked up from his phone, but only for a second. His expression reminded me of little boys sitting outside the principal's office waiting for bad news. I should have walked out right then. Maybe some part of me already understood what was happening. But women like me are trained to keep the peace. We smooth tablecloths after arguments. We refill wine glasses before conversations become uncomfortable. We smile through humiliation because we think dignity means silence. So I sat down in the chair they had prepared for me while 20 people watched like an audience waiting for the show to begin. Richard stood slowly, adjusting the cuff of his navy blazer. I remembered helping him pick that blazer last Christmas. He cleared his throat and lifted a champagne glass. "Evelyn," he began carefully, "this year marks a new chapter for all of us." The room became painfully quiet. Somewhere behind me, silverware clinked against a plate. Vanessa stepped closer and placed a small white gift box in my lap. It was wrapped with a satin ribbon. For one foolish second, I thought maybe I had imagined the tension. Maybe this really was a surprise party. Maybe Richard had finally remembered how much I loved thoughtful gestures. My fingers trembled slightly as I untied the ribbon. Inside the box was a key attached to a leather tag with an address written in black ink. Beneath it sat a thick stack of papers folded neatly into thirds. I stared at the first page until the words stopped making sense. Petition for dissolution of marriage. My ears started ringing. Around me nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I looked up slowly at my husband, but his face had already turned away from mine. Vanessa touched my shoulder gently, almost tenderly. "Richard thought it would be easier this way," she said softly. "We already rented you a condo about 40 minutes away. It's smaller, quieter, more manageable for this stage of your life." I looked around the room again. Every single person avoided my eyes, even my own son. And suddenly I realized this wasn't a birthday party at all. It was an eviction with cake and champagne. I do not remember leaving the restaurant. Later, I would try to piece the evening back together like broken glass scattered across a hardwood floor. But certain moments stayed blurred around the edges. I remembered someone bringing me my coat even though I had not asked for it. I remembered Vanessa hugging guests near the doorway while soft music continued playing behind her like nothing unusual had happened. Most of all, I remembered Daniel finally looking at me as I walked out. He looked ashamed. Not angry. Not conflicted. Ashamed. Somehow that hurt more. The drive home from downtown Stamford usually took 35 minutes, but that night it felt endless. Rain tapped lightly against the windshield while the divorce papers sat untouched on the passenger seat beside me. Every time I stopped at a red light, I caught myself staring at the leather keychain they had given me. Apartment 4B. A furnished condominium somewhere in Norwalk that my husband and daughter-in-law had apparently chosen for me without asking whether I wanted to leave my own home. I kept gripping the steering wheel tighter because if I loosened my hands even slightly, I thought I might start shaking and never stop. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was still on. I had left it burning before the party because I thought we would all come home together afterward. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning. White shutters. Blue hydrangeas near the mailbox. The wind chime beside the garage Richard bought during our anniversary trip to Cape Cod. Everything looked painfully ordinary. That was the strange thing about betrayal. The world did not crack open when your life fell apart. The refrigerator still hummed. The clock still ticked. Somewhere down the street, somebody laughed while unloading groceries from their car. I walked into the kitchen and noticed the birthday flowers I had arranged that afternoon before leaving for the restaurant. White lilies. Fresh eucalyptus. Candles still sitting untouched in the center of the table. I had spent nearly an hour preparing this kitchen because I thought Daniel and Vanessa might come back afterward for dessert and coffee. There was still a cheesecake in the refrigerator from the bakery near Riverside Avenue. Vanilla bean with fresh strawberries. Richard's favorite. I stood there staring at it for a long time before finally closing the refrigerator door again. My reflection in the stainless steel looked older than 53. Older than my mother had looked at 70. I removed my earrings carefully and set them beside the sink. One by one. Tiny movements. Tiny sounds. The kind that suddenly become deafening when a house no longer feels safe. Around midnight, I heard Richard's car pull into the driveway. I remained seated at the kitchen table while his footsteps moved slowly through the front hallway. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He loosened his tie and avoided looking directly at me, the same way he had avoided me all evening. "You should have told me before tonight," I said quietly. My voice surprised me. It sounded calm, almost detached. Richard exhaled heavily as though I had inconvenienced him by speaking at all. Vanessa thought it would be easier if everyone was there. Easier. I looked down at my wedding ring resting against the coffee mug in front of me. 30 years of marriage reduced to a word like easier. "You let her turn my birthday into a public meeting," I said. He rubbed his forehead. "Evelyn, please do not make this uglier than it already is." That sentence settled into my chest harder than the divorce papers had. Not because he wanted to leave. Not even because he had humiliated me in front of our friends. It was because he genuinely believed I was the difficult one for feeling hurt. Richard glanced toward the hallway before speaking again. "The movers are scheduled for Friday. Vanessa already coordinated most of it." Friday. 4 days away. 4 days to dismantle a life I had spent 3 decades building. I nodded slowly and looked around the kitchen one more time. The polished cabinets. The family photos near the refrigerator. The initials Daniel carved into the pantry door when he was 8 years old. Richard followed my gaze but said nothing. Neither did I. Because in that moment, sitting beneath the warm kitchen lights with my untouched birthday cake still inside the refrigerator, I realized something terrifying. My husband and daughter-in-law had not just planned my exit. They had planned it together for a very long time. I barely slept that night. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up pretending and walked downstairs in my robe while the rest of the house sat buried in silence. The hardwood floors felt cold beneath my feet as I moved through the kitchen, turning on small lights one at a time. Above the sink hung the framed watercolor Daniel painted in second grade. A crooked lighthouse beside uneven waves. Richard used to joke that it looked more like a melting candle than a lighthouse, but I had kept it there for 24 years anyway. Mothers do things like that. We preserve pieces of people even after they stop preserving pieces of us. I made coffee even though my stomach could not handle it. The machine hissed loudly in the quiet house, and for some reason that sound made my chest tighten. Everything suddenly felt too loud. The refrigerator. The clock above the stove. The rainwater dripping from the gutters outside. I sat at the kitchen island holding the warm mug between my hands while memories began surfacing one by one, quiet and sharp like pins sliding beneath the skin. Vanessa had entered our lives 6 years earlier wearing soft sweaters and polite smiles. First, I thought she was wonderful for Daniel. She remembered birthdays. She sent handwritten thank you cards. She called me Miss Evelyn even after I told her she did not have to. Looking back now, I realize she studied people carefully before deciding who she wanted to be around them. Around Richard, she laughed too hard at his jokes. Around Daniel, she acted helpless enough to make him feel important. Around me, she played respectful until she no longer needed to. The first strange moment happened 3 years ago during Thanksgiving dinner. Richard carved the turkey while Vanessa stood beside him refilling wine glasses. I remember watching her place her hand lightly on his shoulder while laughing at something he said. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing obvious. But I remember feeling something uncomfortable settle in my stomach before immediately dismissing it. Women my age are taught to distrust our instincts before we distrust other people. After that came smaller things. Richard suddenly cared about clothes again. New cologne. Expensive watches. Gym memberships he barely used before. Vanessa started dropping by the house when Daniel was traveling for work, always with harmless excuses. Returning borrowed dishes. Picking up mail. Asking Richard for advice about investments because he was so much smarter with money. Ignored all of it because the alternative felt ugly and ridiculous. Then last spring, I walked into Richard's office looking for printer paper and found Vanessa sitting in his leather chair while he stood behind her looking at something on the computer screen. The room went completely silent when I entered. Richard smiled too quickly. Vanessa practically jumped up from the chair. I was just asking him about condo markets in Miami, she explained before I had even asked a question. Condo markets. At the time, I thought the explanation sounded strangely rehearsed. Now I understood why. My coffee had gone cold by the time the sun finally started rising outside the kitchen windows. Pale gray light spread slowly across the counters while I stared at the divorce papers still sitting unopened beside my purse. 30 years of marriage reduced to legal language printed on thick cream-colored paper. I heard footsteps upstairs around 6:30. Richard was getting ready for work like any ordinary Thursday morning. Shower running. Closet doors opening and closing. The same routine he had followed for decades. I remained seated at the island while he walked into the kitchen adjusting his cufflinks. For a brief second our eyes met. Neither of us spoke. He grabbed his car keys from the counter and hesitated near the doorway, as though searching for something appropriate to say to the woman he had publicly discarded 12 hours earlier. Finally he cleared his throat softly. Vanessa will come by later to help organize the move. Not I am sorry. Not are you okay. Just logistics. I nodded once and stared down into my untouched coffee. A few seconds later, the front door closed behind him. I sat there listening to his car pull out of the driveway, and for the first time since the restaurant, I stopped feeling shocked. What replaced the shock was colder, clearer, because suddenly I understood something that frightened me more than the divorce itself. Vanessa had not ruined my marriage. She had simply revealed what my marriage had already become. By noon the house no longer felt like mine. That realization came quietly, not with shouting or tears but through small humiliations. That appeared one after another like cracks spreading through glass. Vanessa arrived exactly at 12:15 carrying iced coffees and a leather planner tucked beneath her arm as though she were meeting a client instead of helping remove her mother-in-law from the home she had lived in for 3 decades. She smiled brightly when I opened the door. I brought you oat milk, she said gently. I remembered you stopped drinking regular cream last year. The kindness in her voice felt almost worse than cruelty would have. Cruel people at least allow you the dignity of anger. Manipulative people leave you questioning your own pain. I stepped aside without answering and watched her walk through my hallway like she already owned it. She wore beige slacks and gold earrings shaped like tiny knots. Everything about Vanessa always looked intentional, controlled. She set her planner on the kitchen counter and glanced around the room with a thoughtful expression that immediately made me uneasy. I was thinking, she began carefully. The condo kitchen is much smaller, so you probably will not want to bring all of this cookware. All of this cookware. As though the copper pots hanging above the island were random objects instead of 30 years of family dinners and holidays and ordinary Tuesday nights. I folded my arms quietly while she opened cabinets without asking permission. Richard said the movers are coming Friday morning around 9, she continued. So if we stay organized, this can all be pretty stress-free. Stress-free. I almost laughed at the absurdity of the phrase. Instead, I watched her pull yellow sticky notes from her planner and begin labeling things throughout my kitchen. Keep, donate, storage. The sight of those bright little squares attached to my life made something inside me harden slightly. Vanessa moved efficiently from room to room while speaking in the calm tone people use in hospitals or funeral homes. This guest room furniture will not fit in the condo. You probably do not need all these photo albums. Maybe Daniel can digitize some of these old pictures for you. Old pictures. I stood in the doorway of the den staring at the framed family portrait above the fireplace. We had taken it in Nantucket 7 summers earlier. Daniel still looked young then. Richard's arm rested naturally around my shoulders. Vanessa stood beside us smiling into the camera with perfect white teeth and wind blowing softly through her blonde hair. Looking at that photograph now felt like staring at strangers wearing my family's faces. Around 2 o'clock Vanessa disappeared upstairs while I remained in the living room sorting through books I suddenly realized nobody else wanted. A few minutes later I heard drawers opening in my bedroom, then closet doors sliding back and forth. I climbed the stairs slowly and stopped in the hallway when I saw her holding one of my dresses against herself in front of the mirror. It was navy blue silk. Richard bought it for our 25th anniversary dinner in Boston. Vanessa noticed me standing there and smiled without embarrassment. "This color is gorgeous," she said lightly. "You always had such classic taste." Had. Past tense. As though I were already gone. She carefully returned the dress to the closet before speaking again. "Evelyn, I know this transition feels emotional right now, but honestly the condo will probably be freeing for you. Less upkeep. Less responsibility." I looked around my bedroom slowly. The cream curtains I had sewn myself 15 years ago. The cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Richard's side of the dresser perfectly neat, while my side remained cluttered with perfume bottles and reading glasses and half-finished crossword puzzles. "Did you pick out the condo too?" I asked quietly. Vanessa hesitated for half a second before nodding. Richard wanted somewhere safe. Safe. I finally understood then. Every detail had already been discussed long before my birthday dinner. The apartment. The movers. The timing. Even which pieces of my life they had decided I deserved to keep. Vanessa stepped closer and lowered her voice gently. "I know this is difficult, but Richard has not been happy for a very long time." Her words landed softly, almost compassionately, which somehow made them more brutal. I stared at her for several seconds before answering. Then he should have told his wife, not his daughter-in-law. For the first time since arriving, Vanessa's smile disappeared completely. Vanessa left just before 4 o'clock carrying 2 garment bags and a cardboard box filled with framed photographs she claimed might fit better in the condo. The moment her car disappeared down the street, the house felt strangely hollow, as though the walls themselves had overheard too much. I stood alone in the foyer staring at the empty spaces she had already created. Pale rectangles marked the walls where pictures once hung. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily while late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor in long golden lines. I suddenly realized I had not eaten all day, but the thought of food made my stomach turn. Instead, I wandered through the house slowly, touching familiar objects the way people touch gravestones. The smooth banister Richard refinished himself one summer. The chipped ceramic bowl Daniel made at camp when he was 11. The tiny burn mark on the dining room table from the Thanksgiving Richard tried to flambe bourbon sauce and nearly set the napkins on fire. Every corner of that house held proof that I had built a life there. Yet somehow they had managed to make me feel like a guest waiting too long after dinner. Around 5:30 my phone rang. I almost ignored it because I assumed it was Vanessa calling to discuss moving boxes or utility transfers. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw a name I had not spoken to in nearly 2 years. Claire Morgan. For a second I could not place it. Then memory returned slowly. Claire had once worked with Richard at his law firm before suddenly leaving. Richard always described her as dramatic whenever her name came up. I answered cautiously, "Hello." There was a brief pause before a woman's calm voice responded, "Evelyn, I was not sure if you would pick up." I moved toward the kitchen window automatically, staring out at the hydrangeas swaying softly in the evening breeze. "Claire." "Yes." Another pause. "I heard about the divorce." Something about the way she said divorce made it sound larger than paperwork. Heavier. "People in Richard's office talk," she continued quietly. "Especially after that little birthday spectacle Vanessa organized downtown." Heat crept slowly up my neck. Even strangers knew. I gripped the edge of the counter tightly while Claire exhaled softly on the other end of the line. I know this is probably difficult to hear right now, but there are things you need to understand before you sign anything. My heartbeat slowed in that strange way it does right before fear settles in. What things? Silence filled the line for a moment. Then Claire spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision. Richard has been moving assets around for almost a year. I frowned. What does that mean? It means properties were transferred quietly. Accounts were reorganized. Some things were placed under temporary holding companies connected to Vanessa. The kitchen suddenly felt too warm. Why would my daughter-in-law be connected to Richard's finances? Another pause. Longer this time. Because they trust each other more than they trust anyone else. I closed my eyes slowly. Claire did not say anything inappropriate. She did not need to. Sometimes betrayal announces itself through implication alone. I tried warning people at the firm months ago, she continued. Nobody wanted to get involved because Richard is respected and Vanessa presents herself very well. I stared down at my wedding ring still resting beside the sink where I had left it the night before. Why are you telling me this? Claire's answer came immediately. Because 10 years ago Richard did something very similar to another woman during a divorce case. Quiet transfers. Hidden arrangements. Public humiliation designed to pressure a quick signature. A chill moved through me despite the warm kitchen air. And because, Claire added softly, I do not think they expected you to ask questions. Outside, the sky had begun turning pale orange as evening settled across the neighborhood. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while riding bicycles down the sidewalk. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life continuing while mine quietly unraveled room by room. Do not leave that house yet, Evelyn, Claire said firmly. And whatever you do, do not sign those papers before speaking to someone independent. I swallowed hard. Someone like who? Someone who understands forensic accounting and family trusts. She hesitated briefly before adding, Richard may not legally own as much as he thinks he does. The line went silent after that, but her final sentence remained hanging in my kitchen long after the call ended. For the first time since my birthday dinner, something inside me shifted. Not hope exactly. Something colder. Sharper. Because suddenly I realized there was a possibility my husband and daughter-in-law had made one very serious mistake. They assumed I would leave quietly. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and lay perfectly still beneath the pale gray comforter while rain tapped softly against the bedroom windows. Richard had not come home the night before. His side of the bed remained untouched, smooth and cold beneath the dim morning light. For years that would have terrified me. A missing husband. Silence. Distance. But now the emptiness beside me felt strangely honest. I stared at the ceiling listening to the rain until something inside me finally settled into place. They expected grief, confusion, compliance. What they did not expect was patience. I dressed carefully that morning. Cream sweater, dark jeans, minimal makeup. The same pearl earrings my mother wore every Sunday to church. Tiny rituals of dignity suddenly mattered more than ever. Downstairs, the house smelled faintly of eucalyptus from the flowers I had arranged earlier that week before my life split into before and after. I brewed coffee and opened the kitchen drawer where we kept batteries, spare keys, and old receipts. Beneath a stack of expired coupons sat the small silver key Richard thought I had forgotten years ago. The safe deposit box. My father opened it for me when I turned 35 after my mother passed away. Every woman should keep something that belongs only to her, he told me back then. Richard always laughed at the idea, calling it old-fashioned paranoia. Funny how men mock precautions right until women need them. By 8:30 I was driving toward Greenwich while soft jazz played quietly through the speakers. The roads glistened from overnight rain, and wealthy neighborhoods blurred past my windows in shades of wet stone and manicured hedges. Everything looked polished, controlled. The kind of places where people destroy each other quietly behind beautiful front doors. At the bank, the young man at reception smiled politely and asked for identification. 10 minutes later I sat alone inside a private viewing room, while a long rectangular metal box rested on the polished oak table in front of me. My hands remained steady as I unlocked it. Inside were old documents, jewelry from my mother, several sealed envelopes, and a thick navy folder stamped with my father's initials. I opened it slowly. Trust agreements, property records, investment summaries. The further I read, the colder my expression became. The Stamford house was not solely Richard's asset. It never had been. My father helped us purchase the property 30 years earlier through a protected family trust, designed specifically to shield inherited assets during disputes or legal complications. I remembered signing papers back then without paying much attention because I trusted my husband completely. Apparently my father trusted him far less. By the time I left the bank, the rain had stopped completely. Sunlight broke through the clouds in pale silver streaks while people hurried along sidewalks carrying coffees and briefcases, unaware that my entire understanding of my marriage had shifted in less than an hour. Richard had tried to force me out of a home he legally could not sell without consequences. Worse, if Claire was right about the hidden transfers and manipulated accounts, there could be financial exposure far beyond a simple divorce settlement. I sat inside my car gripping the steering wheel, while memories rearranged themselves inside my mind. Vanessa discussing condo markets. Richard suddenly obsessing over financial restructuring. The quiet meetings behind closed office doors. None of it had been random. They had been preparing for this for months. Maybe longer. My phone buzzed just as I pulled onto the highway. Vanessa. I let it ring twice before answering. Good morning, she said. Brightly. I just wanted to confirm the movers for tomorrow. Richard also thought it might be easier if you stayed at the condo tonight, so everything feels smoother emotionally. Easier. Smoother. Their favorite words. I glanced toward the navy folder resting on the passenger seat beside me. Actually, I said calmly, I do not think I will be leaving tonight. Silence met me immediately. Small. Sharp. Controlled. Then Vanessa laughed lightly as though I had made a harmless joke. Evelyn, I know this process feels overwhelming, but delaying things will only create more tension. I smiled slowly to myself while traffic moved steadily around me beneath the bright Connecticut sky. No, I said softly. I think the tension was already there. I just finally noticed it. Before she could respond, I ended the call. Then I drove home to the house they thought they had already taken from me. When I pulled into the driveway that afternoon, Richard's car was already there. So was Daniel's. Through the front windows I could see movement inside the kitchen, blurred figures crossing beneath warm lights like actors rehearsing a scene they thought had already been written. I sat in my car for a moment with the engine still running, staring at the house that suddenly felt less like a home and more like a negotiation table. Then I picked up the navy folder from the passenger seat, turned off the ignition, and walked inside. The moment I entered the kitchen, the conversation stopped. Richard stood near the counter with his sleeves rolled halfway up his arms, while Daniel sat stiffly at the island nursing a bottle of sparkling water he clearly was not drinking. Vanessa remained beside the stove arranging flowers into a tall glass vase as though she belonged there more than I did. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Vanessa smiled carefully. We were just talking about tomorrow, she said in that soft polished voice of hers. I made reservations for dinner afterward so the day feels less stressful. I hung my purse beside the doorway and placed the navy folder quietly on the kitchen table. Tomorrow is not happening, I replied. Richard's expression tightened immediately. Evelyn. Just my name. One warning syllable. The same tone he used years ago whenever Daniel spilled juice near expensive furniture. I walked toward the refrigerator slowly and poured myself a glass of water before responding. Tiny movements. Calm movements. I could feel all three of them watching me carefully now. I went to the bank this morning, I said. Daniel finally looked up. Richard's shoulders stiffened almost invisibly. Vanessa stopped touching the flowers. Interesting how quickly silence exposes guilt. What bank? Richard asked too casually. I turned toward him holding the glass in both hands. The one with the safe deposit box my father opened for me. His face changed then. Just slightly. But after 30 years of marriage, I knew every version of Richard Harper's silence. This one was fear. Daniel frowned softly. Dad. Richard ignored him. Evelyn. Now is not the time to create unnecessary complications. I almost smiled hearing that word again. Complications. As though discovering the truth about my own marriage were some rude inconvenience interrupting everyone else's schedule. Vanessa recovered first, of course. She always did. Maybe we should all sit down, she suggested gently. Emotions are obviously high. I looked directly at her for the first time since entering the house. You have spent days labeling my belongings with sticky notes while planning my removal from this house like a corporate relocation project, I said calmly. Please do not talk to me about emotions. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat while Vanessa's expression froze for half a second before smoothing itself back into polite concern. Richard stepped forward. The house situation has already been settled legally. I reached into the folder and removed several photocopied documents before sliding them across the counter toward him. No, I replied softly. It has not. The kitchen went completely silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator behind us. Richard scanned the top page quickly, then again more slowly. Color drained from his face little by little while Daniel watched in confusion. What is that? My son asked quietly. Richard said nothing. He simply kept reading. Finally, Daniel grabbed one of the pages himself. His eyes moved across the document before widening slightly. Wait, he murmured. Grandpa's trust owns part of the house? I nodded once. Vanessa folded her arms carefully. That cannot be right. It is, I answered. And according to the trust conditions, any attempt to force liquidation through concealed transfers or manipulated asset shielding triggers a legal review. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Richard placed the papers down slowly like they had suddenly become dangerous to touch. For the first time since my birthday dinner, he looked genuinely uncertain. Who exactly have you been speaking to? He asked quietly. I met his eyes steadily across the kitchen island where I had once packed Daniel's school lunches and hosted Christmas breakfasts and folded laundry while listening to weather reports beside the man who now looked at me like a stranger. People you underestimated, I said softly. Then I picked up my water glass and walked upstairs to my bedroom while silence swallowed the entire house behind me. That evening nobody mentioned movers anymore. The yellow sticky notes Vanessa had placed around the house slowly disappeared one by one, while tension settled into every room like cigarette smoke that would not clear. Richard locked himself inside his office for nearly 3 hours making phone calls in a low voice. Daniel remained mostly silent, pacing between the kitchen and patio with the restless energy of someone realizing too late that he never understood the full story. Vanessa tried maintaining control of the atmosphere at first. She cooked dinner, lit candles, poured wine nobody drank. But underneath her polished calmness, I could sense something cracking. Manipulative people are comfortable controlling emotions. They panic when facts enter the room. Around 8 o'clock I walked downstairs wearing soft gray pajamas, and found Daniel sitting alone at the kitchen island staring at his phone. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. For a moment I saw the little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms carrying his stuffed bear beneath one arm. Parenthood is cruel that way. Your heart keeps remembering children even after they become adults capable of hurting you. Daniel looked up slowly when I entered. Mom, he said quietly. I opened the refrigerator and reached for a bottle of water before answering. Yes. He hesitated several seconds. Did Dad really hide things from you? I closed the refrigerator door gently. What do you think? Daniel rubbed both hands across his face like someone trying to wake himself from a bad dream. Vanessa told me the divorce was mutual at first. She said you and Dad had been unhappy for years. I leaned against the counter studying my son carefully beneath the warm kitchen lights. And did that birthday party feel mutual to you? His eyes dropped immediately. Silence answered for him. After a moment he spoke again, softer this time. I did not know about the trust. No, I replied calmly. You did not know many things. The words were not cruel. Just true. Daniel swallowed hard. Vanessa said the condo was your idea originally. I almost smiled hearing that. The lies had layers now. Careful layers built slowly over time until even my own son no longer recognized where manipulation ended and truth began. Footsteps sounded behind us before Vanessa entered carrying her wine glass with both hands. Her makeup remained flawless, but there was tension around her mouth now that had not existed before. Richard followed a few seconds later looking pale and distracted. Nobody sat down. The kitchen suddenly felt like a waiting room before surgery. Finally Richard cleared his throat. I spoke with my attorney. Attorney. Not our attorney. His attorney. Interesting how quickly language changes when loyalty disappears. And? I asked. Richard glanced briefly toward Vanessa before answering. The trust complicates matters. Complicates. Another careful word. Men like Richard spend entire careers turning destruction into professional vocabulary. Vanessa stepped forward quickly. But obviously we can still reach an understanding like civilized adults. I looked at her over the rim of my water glass. Civilized adults usually do not ambush someone with divorce papers at their birthday party. Her face tightened. Richard exhaled heavily. Evelyn, dwelling on that night solves nothing. I set the glass down slowly on the counter. That night told me everything. Silence filled the kitchen again. Long, heavy, uncomfortable. Then Daniel suddenly spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Dad, is there something going on between you and Vanessa? The question landed like shattered glass. Vanessa froze instantly. Richard's expression darkened with shock and anger. Absolutely not, he snapped too quickly, too sharply. Daniel looked between them both with growing unease. Then why is she involved in your financial accounts? He asked quietly. Why does she know more about this divorce than I do? Vanessa set her wine glass down carefully beside the sink. Daniel, your father trusted me because somebody needed to manage this situation rationally. Rationally. There was that word again. As though empathy itself were weakness. Daniel stared at her silently while something painful shifted across his face. Not certainty yet, but doubt. Real doubt for the first time. Richard stepped forward immediately. This conversation is finished. But nobody moved. The four of us remained standing beneath the soft kitchen lights surrounded by polished countertops and untouched wine glasses and 30 years of family memories hanging silently on the walls. And for the first time since my birthday dinner, I realized something important. The house was no longer falling apart quietly. Cracks were finally becoming visible to everyone. 3 months later, the hydrangeas outside the house had begun blooming again. Pale blue clusters stretched along the walkway exactly the way they did every summer, indifferent to everything that had happened inside those walls. I stood on the back patio early one morning holding a cup of coffee while cool Connecticut air moved softly through the trees behind the property. For the first time in a very long time, the silence around me felt peaceful instead of lonely. The divorce proceedings had changed quickly after the trust documents surfaced. Richard's attorneys stopped speaking with confidence almost overnight once forensic accountants became involved. Hidden transfers led to questions. Questions led to records. Records led to more records. Eventually even Richard realized the strategy he and Vanessa built so carefully had started collapsing under its own weight. The Stamford house remained protected under the family trust exactly as my father intended decades earlier. Richard no longer talked about selling it. In fact, Richard barely talked to anyone anymore. He moved into a luxury apartment downtown after leaving the house 6 weeks earlier, carrying garment bags and box files through the front door while avoiding eye contact with the neighbors. Funny how humiliation feels different when the audience changes. Vanessa disappeared from family gatherings almost immediately after the financial investigation began. Friends at the country club stopped calling as often once rumors spread about hidden accounts and private arrangements. People like Vanessa survive through image. Once cracks appear publicly, everything underneath begins falling apart very quickly. Daniel took it the hardest. One evening about a month after Richard moved out, he came over unexpectedly carrying takeout containers from my favorite Italian restaurant in Riverside. He looked exhausted, older than 34. We sat together at the kitchen island eating pasta beneath the warm lights while rain tapped softly against the windows. The same kitchen where my marriage had quietly unraveled piece by piece. I should have seen it, he admitted finally, staring down at his untouched glass of water. Mom, I do not even know when everything became so twisted. I watched him carefully before answering. Sometimes people do not notice manipulation because it arrives dressed as help. Daniel nodded slowly while emotion tightened across his face. Vanessa kept telling me she was protecting the family. I thought about that sentence for several seconds. Protecting the family. Interesting how often cruel people describe control as protection. Daniel looked around the kitchen quietly. Are you really staying here alone? I smiled softly into my coffee cup. I am not alone, Daniel. And for the first time I truly meant it. Because somewhere between the birthday dinner and the legal meetings and the endless quiet nights, I had stopped fearing my own company. Richard called twice after that trying to talk privately. I declined both times. Not out of anger anymore. Anger requires emotional energy, and I no longer wanted to spend mine carrying the weight of people who discarded loyalty so easily. Some endings do not deserve dramatic confrontations. Some deserve distance. On the morning my divorce became official, I drove alone to the Connecticut shoreline just after sunrise. The sky stretched pale pink above the water while small waves rolled steadily against the rocks below the pier. I sat on a weathered bench wrapped in a cream-colored coat holding a paper cup of coffee between my hands. Seagulls drifted overhead while boats rocked quietly in the harbor. Ordinary things. Beautiful things. The kind you stop noticing when your entire life revolves around keeping peace for people who would never protect yours. My phone buzzed once inside my purse. A message from Richard. I did not open it. Instead, I watched sunlight slowly spread across the ocean while cold wind lifted strands of silver from my hair. 3 months earlier, they handed me divorce papers at my own birthday party, because they believed humiliation would make me weak. They believed shame would make me disappear quietly. But sitting there beside the water with the sound of waves rising gently beneath the morning sky, I finally understood something neither Richard nor Vanessa ever did. The most dangerous woman in the room is not the loudest one. It is the woman who finally realizes she has nothing left to fear.